Well, first of all, I'm an American historian, and secondly, I specialize in frontier history, history of the American West, history of Nebraska, and I also work a great deal with immigrant groups. I don't think that Nebraskans understand the extent to which ethnicity is still important in the lives of people. It's not as important as it formerly was, but it's still very important, and in all sorts of subtle ways. Sometimes it's important in terms of attitudes and beliefs, in ways in which sometimes the people themselves don't understand. I would like for Nebraskans to understand their place in the history of the United States as part of the nation, and it's the relationship of Nebraskans to their environment, for example. I think that's very important. From one point of view, I think that one might say that the fact that Nebraska is the state from which Senator George Norris came is a matter of considerable importance, because Norris was one of the great senators in the history of the United States and accomplished a great deal for the country as a whole, not just for the state of Nebraska. And so Vicki asked me to read from my recent book called A Harmony of the Arts, which is the book on the Nebraska State Capitol. What the chapter is about is well, it's entitled The Capitals and the Capitals of Nebraska. And I'm not stuttering. You see, the first capital is spelled A-L and the second capital is O-L. In other words, the capital cities and then the capital buildings of Nebraska. You know, which were they, why were they, what was done, and this, of course, is intended as a part of our 125th anniversary of statehood. So I'll be reading about that. When Europeans visit the Great Plains region of the United States, they're often impressed by the newness of the place. Coming from communities that are often filled with physical evidence of great age, they are reminded that here virtually none of the visible marks of Euro-American culture are more than a mere century old. Before 1854, the year in which Nebraska was legislated into existence, permanent residence in this place was technically illegal, except for the never numerous Indians, a few fur trappers and traders, and some soldiers and their camp followers clustered around Fort Kearny. Nebraska had no population. It had no government, no capital city, and of course, no capitol building. Yet a mere 80 years passed from that time to the dedication of Nebraska's present magnificent state house, which remains the preeminent symbol of the state and its progressive spirit. There had been no clamor in Nebraska for the creation of a territorial government. That came instead from politicians in the national capital who wished to build a transcontinental railroad across the vast and empty spaces of the Great Plains. Recognizing the need for some sort of government in the area where the projected transportation link between East and West was to be constructed, Congress enacted the bill establishing the territories of Kansas and Nebraska in May 1854. And by the end of June, treaties with Indians had opened lands along the Missouri River for private ownership. Immediately thereafter, hundreds of settlers poured into the territory. Within weeks, several new towns sprang up on the west bank of the Missouri River, including Omaha, Nebraska City, and Brownville. But only Bellevue, located a few miles north of the mouth of the Platte River, bore any resemblance to a settled community before that fateful summer. And at that time it was home to not more than 50 persons. Which settlement was to serve as the capital of this fledgling territory? No one knew for sure because the law did not specify where the seat of government was to be located. In effect, the capital would be located wherever the newly appointed governor of the territory decided to conduct the business of his office. President Franklin Pierce, in conformance with the law, had appointed Francis Burt, an undistinguished politician from South Carolina, to be the new governor. But he did not arrive in Nebraska until early in October 1854. In the meantime, people continued to stream into the territory to establish more or less permanent residence. What kind of persons were they? Most were young, vigorous, aggressive. Males were in the majority, though not overwhelmingly so. Few were men of means, and although most were literate, a large proportion had only the rudiments of a formal education. Most were from the states directly east: Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Others hailed from the south, but relatively few originated in New England or upstate New York. Immigrants from Europe, chiefly England, Ireland, and Germany, were also among the earliest Nebraskans. Most of these diverse folk came up the river from Missouri or across the river from Iowa. Often willing to take significant risks, they came to Nebraska hoping to get rich as quickly as possible and with minimal regard for the niceties of established procedures. Nebraska's founding fathers, unlike those who gathered in Philadelphia in 1776 to declare the nation's independence, were not a distinguished group. They were ordinary people looking for ways to get ahead in a competitive world. An election was held in autumn of 1854 to choose the first members of the territorial legislature. To no one's surprise, almost all were connected in some way with town site speculation or promotion, either directly or indirectly, such as a newspaper editor of a weekly sheet created to publicize a new community and to facilitate the sale of lots. For persons of such interests, the location of the new territorial capital was a matter of supreme importance. If a person had invested much in a town, let us say, for example, Brownville, he could greatly enhance the possibilities for success by getting his town selected as the capital. In that case, Brownville, unlike many others founded in those hectic months, would probably survive. Growth would be virtually guaranteed. Business ventures of many kinds were likely to succeed. Carpenters and masons would find much employment. Storekeepers would find business brisk. Printers would secure government contracts. And lawyers would be attracted like bees to honey. Thus, for the first years of Nebraska's existence as a political entity, capital location was the dominant issue, just as politics was the lifeblood of territorial town site speculators. Because the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 had specified that the first territorial legislature would meet at a time and place designated by the territorial governor, the question of who this man was and what his priorities were was of crucial importance to the town site speculators. Finally, early in October, President Pierce's appointee, Francis Burt, arrived by steamboat from St. Louis. The trip had been difficult, and Burt was deathly ill. He disembarked at Bellevue, went straight to bed, and stayed there until October 16th, when he roused himself sufficiently to take the oath of office. He died 2 days later. It was not an auspicious beginning for Nebraska. Although Governor Burt never made his plans clear in the matter of capital location, he almost surely intended that it was to be Bellevue. Had he lived, it is likely that Bellevue would be the capital of Nebraska today, and that the city of Lincoln would not even exist. But Burt died, and into his office as acting governor strode the territorial secretary, a young man of 25 years named Thomas Cumming, someone who had rather different ideas about the location of the capital. Cumming was a journalist from Keokuk, Iowa. His appointment as territorial secretary flowed from the political influence of a group of Iowans in Washington who were desirous for the Nebraska Capitol to be located immediately across the Missouri River from Council Bluffs, a town that had been in existence for several years. Some of his reporters in Washington were investors in the Council Bluffs and Nebraska Ferry Company. Obviously, if the Nebraska Capitol could be located in Omaha, Council Bluffs and everyone who had invested in its success would benefit significantly. So in the fall of 1854, there was much conniving, possibly even bribery, as acting Governor Cumming decided that the newly elected legislators would convene not in Bellevue, but in Omaha City, as it was optimistically called. The permanence of this new city was by no means guaranteed at that time. It consisted of no more than a score of buildings, including houses, saloons, stores, and so-called hotels. Cumming's intentions are further revealed by his decisions regarding legislative districts, all of which served to strengthen Omaha at the expense of citizens living south of the Platte River. Thus, even though the population of the country south of the Platte was twice as great as that for the area to the north, Cumming assigned 14 seats to Omaha and the North Platte country, while the South got only 12. Similarly, Cumming's appointments to the Territorial Council, which functioned like a Senate, gave 7 seats to the North and 6 to the South. Motions were repeatedly introduced to amend the bill that designated Omaha as the capital and to substitute the name of other cities, among them Plattsmouth, Bellevue, Brownville. Such efforts were always defeated by 1 or 2 votes. Finally, the opposition gave up, and Omaha won 7-6 in the council and 14-11 in the assembly. Entirely inadequate as it was, the first Capitol building was intended to serve only temporarily. In February 1855, Mark Izard, who was President Pierce's replacement for the deceased Francis Burt, assumed his duties as Nebraska's second territorial governor. And it was during his administration that the second capital was planned and constructed. Now the Founding Fathers began to think in more grandiose terms as they planned a building suitable for the new and rapidly growing territory. a reasonably attractive structure done in a manner imitative of the federal style, the second Capitol was erected on a commanding site west of the business district where it dominated the Omaha horizon. Like so many other public buildings constructed in those frontier times, the second territorial Capitol was built by contractors who were either dishonest or incompetent. By 1870, after the Capitol had been moved to Lincoln, the hazards of occupants were so great that the structure was condemned as unsafe, torn down, and replaced by Omaha High School. Meanwhile, the South Platte faction in the territorial legislature continued efforts to move the Capitol away from Omaha. At one time, the legislators actually passed a bill to move the Capitol to a town called Douglas, which was presumably located in Lancaster County. Governor Izard angrily vetoed the measure, charging that Douglas was, quote, a floating town, not only without location, but also without inhabitants. Its existence, Izard said, quote, seems to be confined to the brain of some desperate fortune hunter, and its identity reposes in an indefinable number of certificates of stock for $500 each, neatly gotten up and handsomely executed, unquote. In 1858, the Capitol fight led to a different strategy. In this instance, a majority of the legislators, mostly from south of the Platte, approved a simple motion to reconvene the next day in the village of Florence, which of course is now on the north side of Omaha within the city limits. But the newly appointed territorial governor, third one, William Richardson was his name, refused to recognize this Florentine legislature, even though it had a majority in both houses. Thus nothing came, neither of this removal effort nor of a subsequent threat made in 1859 by the South Platters to secede from Nebraska Territory and to join Kansas. As a matter of fact, Kansas would have none of the scheme, and in a constitutional convention soundly defeated a measure to annex the South Platte country. With the advent of the Civil War in 1861, the agitation over the capital location abated somewhat as the question of statehood displaced it. This prospect was raised prematurely, it seems, because federal law requires a minimum population of 60,000. The census of 1860, however, revealed that less than 30,000 inhabitants lived in Nebraska Territory. As the Civil War ran its course, political pressure developed in Washington for the creation of new states that could be expected to support the re-election of Abraham Lincoln in 1864. Both Nevada and Nebraska territories were possibilities. In January 1864, the Nebraska legislature petitioned Congress to enact a law to make statehood possible. It was an enabling resolution. And Congress responded favorably in April. Meanwhile, opposition to statehood grew, especially among Democrats, and the movement was defeated by the voters of the territory, mostly because they believed that statehood would bring higher taxes. Another major effort at statehood was mounted by Republican leaders in 1866. Employing tactics that were questionable even for that permissive era, advocates for statehood won a narrow victory in a popular election, and a proposed constitution was dispatched to Congress for approval. Congress, however, objected to a provision that limited the right to vote to whites and demanded that the restriction be removed. The legislature, technically still a territorial body, but in fact elected as a branch of state government, complied by amending the document appropriately and returning it to Washington for the presidential signature. President Andrew Johnson then reluctantly signed the proclamation admitting Nebraska as the 37th state on March 1st, 1867, 125 years ago. Omaha was still the capital of Nebraska as the legislature reconvened without new elections in May of 1867, but not for long. Legislators from the more populous South Platte country were relentless in their determination to take the prize away from Omaha, even though on practical grounds there were no compelling reasons to do so. Even the allegedly crumbling territorial capital, only a decade old, could have been satisfactorily repaired. Nevertheless, one of the first bills introduced into the new state legislature called for the removal of the capital from Omaha. Quickly passed by both houses and signed into law by Governor David Butler, the law specified that a commission consisting of the governor, the Secretary of State, and the state auditor should select a new site of 640 acres on state-owned land for the capital location. Furthermore, the site was to be chosen from lands south of the Platte River, somewhere within a tract consisting of Seward County, the northern 2/3 of Lancaster County, and the southern halves of Saunders and Butler counties. Lots in the new capital were to be sold to the highest bidders. The money derived from this source was to be used as a state building fund. The law further required that the State University and Agricultural College be combined as one institution and that it be located in the capital city. Further specified that the state penitentiary also was to be located in or near the new capital city. An Omaha senator, believing that he might alienate Democratic votes in favor of the measure and thereby prevent the removal, successfully amended the bill to name the new capital after the recently assassinated Republican president, Abraham Lincoln. His scheme failed on June 14, 1867, as the state Senate approved the capital removal bill 8 votes to 5. The vote in the House of Representatives was proportionately the same, 25 to 14. Omaha legislators, of course, constituted the opposition. The capital commissioners accomplished their task with considerable speed and a certain lack of discretion. Following a hasty tour of possible locations, including Ashland and Yankee Hill, that lay within the specified tract, the commissioners selected a site not on state-owned land as the law specified, but on land donated to the state by residents of the hamlet of Lancaster, population 30, for the purpose. The commissioners were especially attracted by the proximity of the proposed site to well-known saline deposits that, in their mistaken opinion, offered good possibilities for commercial development, thereby affording the new capital an economic base in addition to the governmental. In fact, however, the saline basin subsequently produced more debts than profits, and had the effect of forcing urban development in Lincoln south and eastward, away from lands that, until recent decades, were annually subject to flooding. The sale of lots in the new capital city began a month later, on September 18th, 1867. The fate of Lincoln as a city, like the political prospects of its backers, was inseparably linked to the success of the auction. If sales were slow or the bids low, there would be insufficient money for the construction of the Capitol. The three Capitol commissioners, David Butler, Thomas Kennard, and John Gillespie, were frankly worried. If Lincoln failed to come into existence as a city, the Omahans were sure to abort the removal process. The Omaha Republican newspaper declared that a city founded on fiat was destined to fail. Quote, "Nobody will ever go to Lincoln," it predicted, "who does not go to the legislature, the lunatic asylum, the penitentiary, or some of the state institutions," unquote. Certainly it was in the interest of this newspaper to ignore the successful precedents established by the national capital in Washington, or by Madison, the state capital of Wisconsin. Still, it was clear that as a city, Lincoln might die at birth. As the Republican was pleased to point out, Lincoln lacked all the advantages offered by a location on a river or a railroad. The results of the first sales were dreadful and produced a mere tenth of what the commissioners had hoped for. Few potential buyers were willing to risk being the first to invest. Something had to be done quickly. Not above resorting to, quote, irregularities, unquote. The commissioners secretly plotted with a group of investors from Nebraska City to force the bidding to prices higher than the appraised value of the lots. Reversing an earlier decision, they also agreed to join individually in the bidding, thereby hoping to generate new confidence in the whole enterprise. The logjam was thus broken, and within several weeks, over $50,000 had been raised. For the moment, Lincoln's future seemed assured. Thomas Kennard, for one, demonstrated his confidence in the future of Lincoln by building a lovely mansion for himself just one block east of the Capitol Square. Gracefully done in an Italianate revival style, the structure stands today as a well-preserved and charming remnant of Lincoln's turbulent and uncertain beginnings. Meanwhile, the legislature continued to meet in Omaha as it waited for the completion of the first state capitol building on the 4-block square set aside for that purpose in Lincoln. The Capitol Commissioners advertised in several Nebraska newspapers for the submission of plans and specifications for the new structure, which was to cost $40,000. At first, there were no responses to their call. Finally, after the commissioners placed a notice in the Chicago Tribune, a submission was received from a Chicago architect named James Morris, characterized by one historian of the time as a, quote, fifth-rate architect. Morris proposed a structure so unattractive that, one suspects, had any other plan been submitted, his would never have been realized. Construction on Nebraska's first state capitol began in November 1867. An ungainly building, it measured 160 by 70 feet. Facing west, its unimaginative facade was dominated by a disproportionately large tower, 120 feet high. Not a memorable achievement. This two-story structure was to be faced with native limestone. Since no limestone of suitable quality could be found locally, Morris, the architect, as supervisor of construction, successfully appealed to the commissioners for permission to use stone from Gage County to the south. Denounced by some critics as an unwarranted extravagance, this raised the cost to more than $75,000, not including an additional $10,000 for furnishings. Erected in great haste by the only contractor, another Chicagoan, to submit a bid, the building was ready for occupancy in December 1868, about a month before the newly elected legislature was to convene. With a newly constructed capitol in use, it would seem that Lincoln's inhabitants could rest assured that they had successfully weathered the storm. But the State House had been so shabbily built that it, just like the territorial capital in Omaha, began to reveal its structural inadequacies immediately. By 1875, only 7 years after its completion, it was in danger of falling down, according to one account. To many Nebraskans, this was clear evidence that Lincoln was a sink of official corruption at least as bad as Omaha. It is not surprising, therefore, that during the 1870s, there were repeated efforts to remove the capital from Lincoln to a place that was presumably more centrally located in the state, such as Columbus or Kearney. Several bills for this purpose were introduced at various times, but the Lincoln politicians always managed to play off one faction against another and kill such measures in committee. Governor McKelvey, whose furniture is around us in various places here, gave the leadership to build the present state capitol. And that time, Nebraskans finally got it right. Probably the most important is the fact that it was right at the end of the World War. And there were many young Nebraskans who had sacrificed their lives for their country in that war. And there was a strong sentiment to do something as a memorial to them. Now, I think you know, most of you must know, that the Capitol was built as a memorial to the Nebraskans who gave their lives in World War I, just as Memorial Stadium at the university was built at about the same time and for the same purpose. That's a big part of it. Another part of it is the leadership of Governor McKelvey. I think that it might have happened without him, but he was a very capable person who gave excellent leadership to the movement. And so that's a part of it. This whole series of snafus, that is to say, when they had not done the job properly. And there were people that said, now it's time to do the job right. Another thing is that it was intended to be built on a pay-as-you-go plan. In other words, it would not cost a great deal of money. It was designed to cost $10 million, but it was to be paid for as you go. In other words, it was not to be built all at once, but to be built over a longer period of time with a series of biennial appropriations. Remember that Nebraska, in its state constitution, does not allow itself to go into debt farther than $100,000. And so that meant that the money had to be raised for each portion as it was built. And so the construction actually spread out over a dozen years. It, of course, ended up costing more than what they expected in 1920, but that surely didn't come as a great surprise to anyone. Another matter of very great importance is that the building commission, the group of persons who were selected to select the architect, had the benefit of consultation with Thomas Kimball, who was an Omaha architect of national reputation. There are many buildings in Omaha and in Nebraska. There were just a few in Lincoln that were designed by him, including the old Fontanelle Hotel in Omaha, or the Hall County Courthouse in Grand Island, or St. Cecilia's Cathedral in Omaha. Those are just some of the best-known buildings that Thomas Kimball did. Now, Thomas Kimball was a remarkably good choice for their professional consultant. And what Thomas Kimball did was to make sure that what's called the program, that is to say, the formal description of what the building commissioners were looking for, was not too finely prescribed. In other words, they gave a lot of leeway to an architect as to what kind of building could be constructed. They did not specify that it should be in imitation of the national Capitol in Washington, D.C. If you look at other capitals that were built about the same time, Minnesota, Rhode Island, Washington, state of Washington, Missouri, these are all examples of capitals that were built early in the 20th century. Wisconsin is another one, although there's a little more imagination there than in some of the others. You see, by not specifying that, they gave architects of, shall I say, genius, a little bit more leeway. Now, it's interesting when you look at the appropriate chapter in here and look at the drawings of the several competing proposals, how some of them do not rise above the tradition. In other words, it's the same old hackneyed idea. There are a couple that are really quite imaginative. I'd say about 3 of them were quite imaginative. And one of those 3 was imaginative, but it didn't carry out the idea very well. It had the idea of a tower also, like our present Capitol. But it was Bertram Goodhue who just simply came up with a remarkably good proposal. And to this day, well, it is unquestionably the best example of that particular type of architecture that was being built in the 1920s and 30s in the United States. If you go to Los Angeles, for example, and you go to the Los Angeles Public Library, you know, there's a wonderful building there designed by Bertram Goodhue, and in which the symbology is also created by Hartley Burr Alexander of Lincoln, Nebraska. It's not as successful as our Capitol. Or if you go to Washington, D.C. and go to the National Academy of Science, which is right there by the Vietnam Memorial, right across the street, by the statue of Einstein, if you remember that. Look at that building. It was also done by Goodhue. It's a wonderful building. It doesn't hold a candle to the Capitol. You look at other architects who did buildings in that same general style in the 20s and 30s, and there are a lot of them that are very attractive. None of them were quite as wonderful as the Nebraska State Capitol. Genius of Bertram Goodhue, who was one of the great architects in the United States in those years. And I've just mentioned a few things that he's done. He has done, his list of buildings that he designed should make any architect in the history of the United States jealous. It's really quite a remarkable list of buildings that he did either himself or in association with different partners at various times in his career. This was his crowning achievement, and he died in 1925, shortly after the building was underway, but long before it was completed. You see, I think that Hartley Burr Alexander is terribly important for the success of the Capitol. He's the man. He was a professor at the university. He was both an anthropologist and a philosopher and a poet. Remarkable combination. And it was he who defined the symbology throughout the whole Capitol. And in order to appreciate that, again, I can only refer you to the chapter in this book on Hartley Burr Alexander to begin to appreciate it. It is so extensive and so well-informed and so brilliant that it's just something that needs to be studied. Well, other buildings don't have that. The North Dakota Capitol doesn't have anything that approaches the symbology. Then there's another thing you must remember too, and this is a time factor, about what makes ours speak to us. Well, you see, it was done at a time when buildings were conceived by people to embrace, you see, a harmony of the arts. And that changes a decade later. When you get into the 1930s, when you get into the period of the international style, you see, which became what we call modern. Of course, it's long since gone out of date. But those structures, presumably based on the concept of form follows function and a lot of other ideology, this had the part of that ideology of the so-called international style or modernistic architecture sort of almost denied the idea that there should be a harmony of sculpture, of mosaics, of paintings, of all these art forms, that they should be unified in one building. They got away from that. So if you think about sculpture, for example, that is placed in connection with modern, so-called modern buildings, the cube, glass, and steel stuff, they'll have sculpture, but what do? They take it and they separate it from the building and they put it on a plaza of some sort away from the building. It's not integrated as part of the building. Now, if you think of our Capitol, for example, it has many examples on the exterior of what's called engaged sculpture, where these figures sort of move out of the stone of the building and assume a shape and a character. On all sides you can find examples of this. And there is probably no better example in modern American architecture of engaged sculpture than the Nebraska State Capitol. You can find other examples of it. Goodhue did that in another one of his buildings that's very famous, is the Rockefeller Chapel at the University of Chicago. And you can go there. Now that's done in a Gothic revival style, but if you go there and study it, you can find examples of engaged sculpture in that structure, which is of course very harmonious with Gothic architecture. But what happens, you see, is that they're able to take that here, and they're able to do it more successfully than we have seen in other buildings. Now again, you know, how does that happen? Well, it's the genius of this team. Goodhue, you see, the architect, the presiding genius, so to speak. Alexander giving the ideas behind it and the unification of it. And then people like Hildreth Mier, who did the mosaics, and Lee Laurie, who does the sculpture, and the various artists. They're the least successful, the people who do the murals. The murals are, I think, by common consent, the least successful of the harmony of the, shall we say, the most disharmonious element in the harmony of the arts. Thank you very much.